Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to our Monday strategic update with LaRouche PAC. Today is Monday, January 16th, 2023. I'll be joined again today by Michael Stager, and we are going to discussion that Barbara Boyd took up on last week and get into the deeper implications of what is required to continue the dismantling of the deep state. What we're going to discuss today, if you haven't had a chance to look at the LaRouche PAC latest developments in terms of some of the reports that we put out, we're going to get into a little bit of detail as to where we stand in terms of the role of the American people, understanding what is required to restore our republic and what just has transpired over the last several weeks. Most emphatically, we know that the continued exposure of the criminal apparatus around the FBI intelligence community, the censorship program against the American people has been exposed by the revelations with Twitter going after the FBI, CIA, and other deep state intelligence operations. And so it's been for many years, decades, that this has been ongoing. And we know that has been a result, as you have seen from the reports that have been put out and was taken up in detail on last Monday by Barbara Boyd, operations, the same operations that ran a witch hunt against Lyndon LaRouche during the 1980s, have been the same operations that run a witch hunt, the Russia lies, the attack on President Donald Trump, which has now been completely exposed, not just by the Twitter files, but also by the fact that what we witnessed with the debate around the speaker's debate of Speaker McCarthy before McCarthy became the Speaker of the House is very important to understand. And we're going to get into that. I just want to read you one of the latest articles that we put out on this. Barbara Boyd wrote, "The McCarthy Speaker fight, it was really about reclaiming the Republic." And we'll go to some of the details of that. I think the understanding of the role of President Donald Trump in intervening into this fight, the role of the 20 Congress members to not back down, to demand that there has to be a change in the process in the Congress, and the rules package that came out of this is extremely important. I think we are going to get into this more in depth because there has to be a deeper understanding of even what President Trump said today in an interview that he did, that this actually brought the Republican Party together. It was a blessing in disguise, and it was a much needed debate and battle. So we'll talk about some of what the new rules package brings about, especially in terms of the fact of the new committees of investigation into these intelligence community operations, one being led by Representative Jim Jordan, and what is now allowed by the House of Representatives, doing away with the insane thousands of pages of omnibus bills and passing through legislation without much debate at all about it. So we'll hear about that shortly. And as people know, this is going to get deeper into understanding the now operations that have been exposed by Joe Biden, and not just Joe Biden, but his son, as this goes much deeper than Hunter Biden's laptop. What we're talking about now is the same Biden that was going after President Trump and saying that what President Trump did as far as in hiding so-called classified documents, was doing this as not as a president, but as a vice president. And the fact of the matter is Biden's in big trouble. I guess the question we're going to discuss here is he on the way out? And what are the implications of that? The FBI, the intelligence community that went after President Trump, what role have they been playing in this whole operation? So there's a lot to talk about today, and we're going to get into this a little bit more. We're going to get into why this shouldn't be a spectator sport, but we now have a unique moment in front of us to demand justice, to demand that the lies that have been told on President Donald Trump that have led us to this despicable moment in terms of the role of the Biden family now can be brought down, but it's much deeper than the Biden family. We're talking about taking down the globalist British empire and the whole operation to dismantle the United States. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael so we can get into this discussion. And I encourage people again, if you're listening to this broadcast, to go and make sure you study the recent reports that were put up on the website detailing more on the history around the deep state British apparatus and some of the reports that Barbara Boyd is doing in the series that she's putting up right now. So I'll post those in the chat a little bit later and make those available on the YouTube later for people. So with that, Michael, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, Keisha. Hi, everybody. Look, we're at a very intense and I think optimistic process that's quickly unfolding as we would expect it. We would expect some type of expression of what dynamic is actually unfolding during this transition period after the election. And there was all kinds of tea leaves and predictions and analyses of the election. But as we all saw with the speaker fight, 5 people in the House could hold significant power. Now, if there was a 40-person majority, that wouldn't have happened. So it's generally wrong to only look at a political process, one that we would identify as substantial, one that's actually valuable to our lives and the lives of our children and grandchildren, from the mere standpoint of elections or political parties, right? But the mainstream media, most political analysis anywhere, lamestream, independent journalists, Substack, whatever, oftentimes are people that are observing objective processes, objective facts about a certain dynamic. They're not looking at a historical process. And that takes a little bit of patience to evaluate. And if we take a step back and now evaluate what's happening, I think we can all recognize we're at a very critical point where your interventions over these last 2 years have paid off in a substantial way. However small or large they may have been. Sometimes the small ones have more impact than the large ones. It's very how political events and historical processes work within a human social environment cannot be understood from the standpoint of a game show kind of political analysis or a sporting event. There's just something different underlying what governs this. And as Bruce Director said in a very interesting discussion on Saturday, that should be posted soon and everyone should check out if you haven't. Like a play, though all the people on the play today are going to be, in most cases, egomaniacs, self-obsessed about their performance and their career and their CV in terms of their next job. But in a real tragedy, in a real Shakespearean performance, the players submit themselves to clearly a principle far greater than their role. And that's meant to capture to the audience that oftentimes the most important political interventions made, or interventions culturally, sometimes we say political and you may think of a limited scope, but what I mean, what's really meant by politics is questions of culture, questions of advancing the human conception of identity, as Shakespeare did with his plays and language and poetry. So is that we recognize that governing principle and look to contribute to it, enhance it, make it more tangible for the broader audience. And that's really the role of a profound actor or musician or even statesman. As much as Donald Trump is a showman, he, far better than any other person on the political stage today, has looked to make the principles that have been governing our demise and the principles that can govern our success more tangible to the minds of the American people, and I would even argue people globally. So I want to just look at the most recent developments. Where are we in this strategic battle? Barbara Boyd last week presented and will continue to present through a series of articles on the website, and she very likely may make it back for a follow-up on this platform. The LaRouche movement's unique insight into the political fight around the intelligence committee in terms of, or the intelligence community and the deep state, as it's now referred to, I think somewhat accurately. Because we have a unique experience and a unique sense of this, and part of the intention is to help make that to make the American people more self-aware of what these institutions really are, how they've been operating, how they target those actors on the stage that look to make the principles more clear versus play the power game, the horse trading game, the celebrity game show program, rather, which is the superficial nonsense. People like Lyndon LaRouche spent his entire life to make clear this broader principle. In some sense, that's really the reason to celebrate Martin Luther King. It's not the so-called achievements, the neoliberal achievements of what all the commentators today will describe as the civil rights legacy, or Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, all the other kinds of racial obsessions that exist today with wokeism. But that what King recognized was a sense of the immortal soul as a concept embedded within our documents as a nation, and look to inspire a people, not African Americans, but the nation as a whole, to become accountable to that principle. Lyndon LaRouche really saw his mission very much in that same way. And I think that really is the question for all of us today. We all see it. This wokeism, which is certainly a very vicious phenomena, is easily resolved by restoring these profound concepts. That's the true actors on the stage. What we see with this fight for speaker, and so Barbara Boyd's made that clear, I think, in her presentation and discussion last week. You'll see more of that because of our own organization's fight with this. And how it's those types of individuals, King, LaRouche, Trump, many of you on this call, which propose the greater threat because of the substance of the devotion to this entire charade. And it is a charade, and it's a charade that's collapsing. And certainly, it's not hard to point out, who knows what's going to happen with Biden. Clearly, some institutions want to at least set up the fact that it's time to potentially get rid of Biden. Nobody wants Harris. Might they try to throw in Gavin Newsom? Who knows? I'm sure there's a lot of, bets in Vegas on such things. But there is certainly a kind of incompetence. And what I'll touch on as we, in these initial remarks to some degree, are the things that are lying out on the horizon that are far more significant to the unfolding play of our time than merely these declassification documents. But I think we can say clearly that the Obama administration had absolutely no protocol or any kind of national security regards. You had the Biden crime family, you had the Clinton crime family, you had the pay-to-play operations, the Clinton Global Institute, all these operations, which were just massive money laundering programs, both of whom were directly involved in the whole Ukraine operation, the massive foreign policy insanity, the direct use of social media for intelligence control purposes, including what's been revealed in Twitter Files 14. They're literally looking to unmask, like basic warrants, kind of FISA-like warrants to unmask Americans. They're appealing just to the private corporations to do it. Now, if you followed Snowden, if you followed these revelations over the last decade, this has all somewhat been apparent for some time. But again, this is just exposing, again, the level of corruption of that entire Obama team, with the complete loss of national security, a complete corruption of foreign policy, and this kind of insidious, woke, drug-induced cultural outlook that now becomes so evident in our schools and everything else. That's all the Obama administration. All of these documents that Biden has stashed in all of his weird locations stem from that time, and certainly Biden has no idea what's happening. I think we could all agree on that. But there may be all kinds of speculations out there. I don't think the speculations are so important, but certainly there's a sense that Biden could be someone that has to be gotten rid of, that he cannot defend the establishment against the Trump offensive that's now moving. And that really is the point. The speaker's fight was again a display of the MAGA movement and Donald Trump's personal role. He held the line for McCarthy. The 20 objectors to McCarthy, or people that held out for major compromises, did the right thing, and they had a very clear perspective. And yes, it was Matt Gaetz and Lauren Boebert, and they got a lot of media attention. People like Chip Roy and others were directly involved in substantial negotiations that may not have gotten as much media fanfare, may have played an even larger role in setting the clear terms that McCarthy had to abide by. As Matt Gaetz even said it in an interview afterwards, in many cases, they empowered Kevin McCarthy, with all the naysayers saying that they're stripping McCarthy of all of his power, they're terrorists, blah, blah. Nancy Pelosi had set up a dictatorship-like system of the House, where, like in the UK Parliament, the leadership controls everything, and all you get to do as a member is an up or down vote. Really, your job then is to pick a faction that can maybe maneuver into power and become a new leadership over time, rather than having a deliberative process with the elected representatives of our citizens. And so, as Keisha posted, in many ways, this fight was about restoring the republic. But Donald Trump played a critical role, because the danger of all of this, which ultimately has given McCarthy a strong hand, a deliberative body. And if you look at his speech, this section on Lincoln, the section on Washington, very compelling. I didn't expect that from Kevin McCarthy, because sometimes the principle grips people, and the better side of them are touched by the circumstances, and in many ways the crisis and challenge we face. So if you haven't listened to his speech that evening, that Friday evening, it is actually worth listening to, and it's posted in the article that was just up on LaRouche PAC's website. But Trump's role was unique because the danger of this was to allow a dark horse from the establishment to become the new rep, the new potential speaker candidate for a majority of treasonous Republicans. And as soon as the momentum would have shifted from McCarthy, all of the negotiations and debate would have drastically shifted around. It's not McCarthy. Now you've got a new person. We've conceded you don't like McCarthy, because a lot of it was about McCarthy's personality. And that was not necessarily the way you wanted to frame this. But Trump held the line for McCarthy. He saw what happened the last time. When Paul Ryan became the House Majority Leader and Speaker, he replaced Kevin McCarthy, who was first in line even back then in 2010. So, and Paul Ryan has just been a total disaster. So this fight, the way this unfolded was a unique role, and McCarthy gave Trump a lot of credit, because Trump has a sense that this is about improving and finding the best talents of the people that we have, and not a bunch of horse trading and personality contests. We've got to strengthen, and he knows he plays a critical role in directing in what direction they become stronger, but to strengthen the personnel and people that we have. That's real leadership. And that same dynamic that unfolded in that Congress, in this process, has only become reflected in fights at the county and state level all over the country. So we'll cover more on that as it develops, but I think it's a substantial aspect. Now, at the center of this fight was the government abuses that have recently been exposed by the Twitter files, by the ongoing political targeting and attempted political assassination of Trump, like we saw with the Mar-a-Lago raid, which of course was just obscenely abusive. And certainly the Biden document charade is only part of this kind of bizarre drama that's now unfolding. But this is the first time in my lifetime, certainly at least in my adult lifetime, which would be by the early, adolescence in the early 90s, so the last 30 years, that I've seen government take up a fundamental cause of the country in the interest of the population. That we finally have a turning point from what we saw in the 1990s of massive globalization, the wars, the Patriot Act, the bailouts, that you're starting to investigate, because these intelligence community, this FBI and CIA, are the Praetorian Guard that defend the surveillance state, that defend this Davos, which is meeting today with, maybe all kinds of fanfare, but increasing derision from a broad scope of the population. And wars, the bailouts, the surveillance, and so on, that we're finally seeing a shift. But all of this, that the financial system, the surveillance state, the globalization, have all been enforced within Congress. I've even seen it to where you see it enforced even at the level of state and county governments, that the intelligence community plays a role to enforce all of that. Now, what really is this intelligence community? What is their actual role? Well, their role is to have foresight. That's what the role of in foreign intelligence, which would be the CIA, and a domestic intelligence, which the FBI shouldn't be. It's merely a law enforcement agency on behalf of the DOJ, but in some sense, to at least know what's happening within our own country, like what the hell is happening with the border, and who's coming in, who came into our country in early 2000 and ran 9/11 from within our own country. It might have been planned in caves in Afghanistan, supposedly. It was run by people in the United States. The CIA entire mission objective was to bring down the Soviet Union. It didn't even know it was happening when it happened. These institutions, and I raise that so we set a standard for, we do want intelligence agencies. You want them to have the capability of foresight, this was always Mr. LaRouche's emphasis in terms of the role of functioning government, functioning intelligence, strategy, science. The CIA should have been fundamentally reorganized, not added to, not multiple more layers, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the 17 agencies that have been referenced since the Trump attempted coup. Not enhanced, not emboldened, not the NSA, massive collection of data of the American people. But these things should have been drastically reformed because they had lost all competence 34 years ago. Demonstrably. And the same is true with the FBI, which only became stronger after 9/11. But we know the documentation is down in Sarasota, Florida, probably still to this day in some warehouse, of how much intelligence they had on the people funding, supporting, and the actual terrorists of 9/11 operating in the United States. Everyone knows of the Saudi flights that left Florida after all other flights had been grounded. These were extreme failures. And like we discussed a few weeks ago in terms of the 2008 bailouts, it's these types of clear crimes or mistakes where their entire mission orientation is one thing, bring down the Soviet Union. It comes down and you go, we had no idea. There was no plan. Fundamental reforms that then required. And you make those reforms based on the kind of institution you actually have to create, which are creative, patriotic people who are there to help inform government about what's on the horizon and how do we best deal with it in a truthful way, not to run Nazi-based coups in Ukraine with people like John McCain, but to actually have a sense of how do we defend American interests from the standpoint of what's truthful and have an awareness of what's happening in the future. So the Twitter files, this investigation of government abuses, which will expand and move, and part of maybe these Biden documents is to try to obfuscate the committee down a different pathway rather than taking up, which is really the case, which was the attempted coup against Donald Trump, still ongoing. They may defund Jack Smith, the special prosecutor. That would be a fine and excellent thing to do. But the American people in this movement are going to shape this. You know, it's worth recalling that one of the most important aspects of this last election in November was the shift and role played by Tulsi Gabbard, because she came in, she left the Democratic Party, she came out and endorsed candidates from Congress to governors to Senate to other state level positions. And she represented an anti-interventionist, anti-imperial, anti-neocon, neoliberal, against the Washington consensus. In essence, Trump. She hasn't yet said she's endorsing Trump. We'll see if she crosses that line. Everyone's got their kind of boundaries and marketing plans. But to her credit, she added to the idea that the movement we're building is not merely one of a Republican Party grassroots fight for the party per se, but a broader universal movement. Similar to the role that Elon Musk has played since he took over Twitter, to open up these files to a broad kind of set of journalists to add to the dialogue of our country. Someone who is generally agnostic, but has done very decent journalistic work, Matt Taibbi, one of the leading journalists involved in the Twitter project, recently said something very important, that the truth on Russiagate is a basis for healing the country. And it's certainly the case. Now, I tend not to call it Russiagate. I think this constant legacy of Watergate, which was itself a scam, a fraud run by the CIA, is not the these are coups. That was a coup against Richard Nixon. Like him, detest him. It was a coup. It was an attempted coup against the assassination of Kennedy was a coup. I mean, this is the history, intense history of our country that we oftentimes have not addressed at the time effectively. We get caught up in the narrative that's spun by media. It's an attempted ongoing coup against President Trump and the movement and the sense of our republic that he represents. And the truth on that is critical. This movement, as I've said before, is perhaps the most important dynamic in history today. And there was a report that a military advisor to Merkel said that that basically confronted the fraud of the entire narrative around Ukraine and the danger of where this can go. Well, as Lyndon LaRouche was always very clear, the intention by the British Empire was to pull whatever strings necessary to create a conflict with Russia that might seem like a Germany-Russia conflict, but that would ultimately be an Anglo-American direct confrontation with Russia. And he said this in some of his prison writings, which means it goes back over 30 years. The ability for our movement today to resurrect the true United States that did intervene in World War II effectively, but was unable to set the course for the necessary relationships. That we need viable working relationships with Germany, the engine of the European economy, with Russia, a key collaborator, and then of course with China and India, which are the rising Asian powers, which will dominate the coming centuries, if not longer. This is the long-term foreign policy outlook of any patriotic American. Much of Europe has become secondary at best to shape world policy. And yet, yet again, the corruption of Europe, its ability to get sucked into these games by British imperial politics, are creating a dynamic again of a danger of world war. And there's, by every means, this is somewhat threatening. The most threatening aspect is that at this point in time, it's very likely within a week or two, within 1 week, Kiev will face permanently freezing temperatures. It won't go above 30 degrees Fahrenheit. That means all of Ukraine will be with frozen ground. And it is very likely Russia has situated itself, it's rearranged its command structure once again. It has brought into bear over 300,000 troops and huge equipment and capability, including naval vessels, which have deployed into the Black Sea, into Belarus, north of Kiev. There's possible landings in the south in Odessa. There's a possible massive move in the east. We've already seen the offensive by Russia in the recent few weeks in Soledar. And there's a massive buildup in Belarus that could quickly come down from Kiev. No one knows what the Russians are going to do, but their ability to win this is without doubt. They have all of the military capacity and leverage necessary to have a complete and total military victory. I want to remind people that the actual active nature of Russia's special military operation, as it was defined by them nearly a year ago, only really lasted from end of February to the middle of August. From August, there have been no major Russian offensives. So we've had 5 months of active military attack. And then we've had 5 months of a kind of suspended animation of whatever the dynamic is, where Russia began to reevaluate that this was no longer a basis for negotiations. The Germans and French have admitted we never ever meant anything we ever said in the negotiations, that we just, or whether that's true or not from before, it means that negotiations are off the table. Russians can't trust. They're going to have to consolidate a military victory. the danger, and this is one of the factors that may be the reason why certain people in the establishment look to bring down Biden, is because they need someone or some creature capable of moving aggressively against Russia in light of what will be a smashing defeat of Ukraine on the battlefield, where their troops are already exhausted, untrained, unprepared. They're at their kind of last ditch resorts already in terms of personnel deployments. Whether they get more equipment or not is really not the issue. So the danger of this war should not be overlooked. And that the danger of a possible insane action by Biden, the Biden collective, the British Imperial, and those that are orchestrating in Europe, whether it be the Poles or the Romanians, whoever else may be pulled into this, that we are looking at a possible insane escalation rather than an admittance that our entire foreign policy has failed. That notion that our foreign policy has failed, this NATO post-war neoliberal structure has failed, will be increasingly apparent to much of the world. From the standpoint of our movement, this is a unique opportunity, an ability to reshape US foreign policy based on the truth, based on actual American US interests, as Trump did with the rhetoric and attacks against globalization. But it's also a very dangerous point because the enemy, the globalist enemy, currently meeting in Davos with all of their prostitutes, which of course are out, probably the prostitutes probably out, not literally, call girls and such, call boys in many cases, outnumber maybe even the thousands of participants. And that's not, that's just true. It's like the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Who looked to create, much like the world, like the Congress of Vienna looked to create, an anti-American, anti-republic world. But they have ideas of how to exploit Ukraine's loss, which at this point is nearly inevitable, in very dangerous ways. So we have to be strong and fierce around what's true and around the kind of decisions that this Congress is going to make, where this new Republican caucus, now in the House majority, will have a huge role to play in denouncing the kinds of mistakes that are irretrievable. And that's going to be a critical point of intervention. I just want to wrap up. Trump is in motion. His intervention around the speakership was substantial, as I mentioned. He is now going to be building out his campaign structure. He's put out campaign ads. You'll see them on Truth or Telegram or other social media sites you might follow. He's going to be holding a rally in South Carolina sometime soon. There's talk of him building up his campaign staff. I would encourage everyone to kind of look to participate with this kind of campaign in whatever state you might be or states nearby, because we've got to build this campaign and this movement to resonate the higher economic and political conceptions that Trump has brought to bear, some of which, and I've mentioned some like the globalization, the manufacturing, ending the wars, working with Russia and China, working with the nations of Europe, not this collective European Union, which really is not representative of European nations' interests. But there was a recent episode on 60 Minutes, of which I never watched, and I'm sure many of you don't either, but they actually covered the successful fusion experiment at the National Ignition Facility at Lawrence Livermore. And they captured it in a really kind of interesting and American way. That the arm that holds this small diamond pellet of heavy hydrogen, the arm is made of copper, which was melted and kind of distorted from the high heat. I'm not going to cover if you don't know about it, we'll post, Keisha can post some of our material on the experiment. But they said that this will go in the Smithsonian Institute as if it was like Graham Bell's telegraph or Edison's first light bulb, that this is, or like the Wright brothers' first flight in Kitty Hawk that went 150 feet, this experiment represents the potential new age of what was left unsaid, but what should be said, of a new industrial age of American innovation and ingenuity. And that really is what fusion represents. And as they said it in that program in 60 minutes, you give them credit, that if we establish commercial fusion, energy is unlimited. It is relatively, in the metric we would think of it today, an unlimited, infinite supply of cheap and abundant energy. Imagine if that were then deployed, not just in theory, not in concept, not limited to a few places, but deployed en masse around our country and around the world. Projects like this, like fusion, like the Artemis and colonizing the moon and then Mars, SpaceX's Starship, which is capable of becoming soon the largest rocket ever deployed in human history, capable of landing itself upright on the surface of the moon or Mars. That we are really at an age of potential remarkable explosion of human optimism, growth, and development. But to get there, we're going to have to continue the fights we've waged these last 2 years. Our movement has been tested. We didn't get the electoral response we wanted, but I would say that the substance of what we're fighting for has far more manifest itself, and perhaps in ways far more than any of us could have expected in just the last few weeks. We've got to continue that substantial intervention. And if we do, we will have the potential to shape a viable and functioning Congress. We will clean out this Praetorian fascist guard of the globalists in our intelligence community and set the basis for a revival of a true American presidency when Trump begins his second term, if not even sooner. So that's what's possible. I think that's the battlefield. And certainly I think Keisha and I are both excited to see what you guys are thinking. Take your questions and keep up the momentum of the fight we're engaged in. So Keisha, I'll leave it there and see what people are thinking.